So today we're going to have a little history lesson about pre-World War II Germany. There's a very specific reason I'm talking about this, given the current obsession with Nazism. So let's begin, as I take us all the way back to the German Empire circa 1917. During this time, the First World War was coming to a close. The German people were tired, physically and emotionally, from 4 years of war, and as the Americans entered the Allied side, supplying and invigorating them, the German people, disheartened and facing overwhelming odds, had lost their hope and faith in their government, as well as the possibility of claiming victory in the conflict. This discontentment led to massive growth of the two socialist parties in Germany, the Independent Socialist Party of Germany and the Social Democratic Party of Germany, both of which were anti-war. Additionally, the previous success of the February Revolution in Soviet Russia led to the credence in the minds of many to the possibility of a civil revolt in adoption of socialist, even communist, government. The public support of communist and socialist movements in Germany by Soviet thought leaders like Leon Trotsky also served to bolster public opinion regarding communism as a way out of their current sad state. This discontentment among the people and growing support for socialism would grow to a fever pitch after a German U-boat was sent on what could only be described as a suicide mission. Sailors in the town of Kiel began to revolt in protest, committing mutiny and sabotage of their vessels. Within days, thousands of sailors overthrew the town government and were joined in the occupation of the town by a representative of the Social Democratic Party of Germany. That's the SPD. I'm just going to call them that from now on. Although the revolt seemed to stem just simply as a reactionary outrage against the suicide mission, it was now deeply politicized with the involvement of the SPD. By November, the now firmly socialist rebellion had swept across Germany. Protesters seized the city of Munich, and the King of Bavaria fled to Austria, with his kingdom being occupied, and proclaimed the Bavarian Soviet Republic. Meanwhile, the socialist parties and growing rioting and revolt put pressure on Kaiser Wilhelm to abdicate, which was done against his own wishes by serving Chancellor Max of Baden. And with that, the socialist parties of Germany essentially took control of the state. However, all was not so well for the socialists, for within hours of taking control, infighting had already begun, as two different members of the SPD declared Germany both a republic and a free socialist republic on the same day. The splintering was no new concept to the German socialists. It began earlier that year, with members of the SPD splitting to form the Independent Social Democratic Party, which itself contained members of another splinter group, known as the Spartacus League. Started in 1916 by Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht, a loose group of communists and communist sympathizers, publishing anti-war pamphlets and organizing anti-war demonstrations, the Spartacus League had grown in size over the years since its founding, and with the German government now solely in the hands of the socialists, the fight for communism as a possibility for Germany swelled their numbers, and they weren't without help either, as Karl Radek of the Bolshevik Central Committee was sent to Germany to help aid in the revolution. Early on, Rosa Luxemburg found herself at odds with others in the organization, as she disagreed with Stalin on the use of violence and advocated for democratic elections, which was shunned by the likes of Radek and others within Spartacus who had come to idealize Stalin and the idea of a violent citizen revolution. In December, many prominent members of the Spartacus League formed the Communist Party of Germany, the KPD, with the purpose of spreading communism to the nation through any means necessary. Before I go on more about the KPD, real quick, the Weimar Republic, named for where it was signed into being because the commies were so revolting in Munich. Let's talk about it. The people in charge of the Republic were primarily centrists who had led the SPD, and as such, the changes they implemented to German society were actually pretty great. Even as socialists, the changes made by these centrists, or more accurately probably described as social democrats, were good for the people. These folk wasted no time making the changes they wanted to see in their country. Among the early reforms were an 8-hour workday, mandatory breaks, national health insurance, protection from arbitrary dismissal, regulated wage agreements, and universal suffrage for anyone over the age of 20. I know I may have come off as talking bad about these guys, but the centrists were helping a nation in a really bad place. Because despite the many positive changes they made to society, the state was riddled with hyperinflation and forced to pay massive reparations, leading to continual public unrest. So why were things so shitty? Well, that's the fault of the Treaty of Versailles. The only way the Allies would agree to peace was for complete and total surrender of Germany. As such, the Treaty of Versailles dismantled the German Empire, which was stripped of all of her colonies, forced to pay egregious reparations to the Allies, drastically demilitarized and subject to something called the War Guilt Clause, which collectively blamed all the German people for the losses and casualties that resulted from the First World War. Particularly, perhaps more than any of the other stipulations that punished Germany in very physical and visceral ways, this fermented in the minds and hearts of the German people, and would continue to sting until that growing resentment of the Allies had reached a boiling point. Now, I'm not going to give you a lecture about the First World War, but I do want to give you a little context. That war began because a bunch of Yugoslavian anarchists killed the heir to the throne of Austro-Hungary, and Germany got dragged into the war by virtue of being Austro-Hungary's ally. So yeah, blaming the whole thing on Germany must have stung. It's like if someone insults your girlfriend and then you sock him in the face, and then he brings 4 of his friends and beats the living hell out of you and makes you write him an apology letter. The unrest first reemerged as our friends the KPD and the Spartacus League had finally had enough of the reasonable reforms and filthy democratic elections being held in the Weimar Republic, accusing them of betraying the revolution. And in January of 1918, they poured into the streets armed in revolt. Through violence and intimidation, they threw their massive hissy fit on the streets of Berlin, eventually taking over a quarter of the city. Despite attempts to meet with their leaders and organizers, the SPD and the Weimar government were unable to contact anyone within the KPD, who actively withdrew from possibilities of communication. So, what was the government to do? If you guessed hire paramilitaries to get rid of the commies, you would be right. Germany's military had been disorganized and scattered due to the ongoing war, but the Free Corps was ready to help the infant republic defend its sovereign territory. The Free Corps was sent into Berlin, where they killed 150 commie civilians, including Rosa Luxemburg, who was beaten over the head with a stock and dumped into a river. You know, poor woman, I do actually feel bad for her. Her error was in putting her faith in commies. So yeah, commies acting like pissy brats, that's not a new one. But it's the dawn hour of your country's brand new republic. And it didn't work out so well now, did it? So did that stop the commie hissy fit? Of course it didn't. Next, the Free Corps was sent in to clear the commies out of Munich, which had since been named the Munich Soviet Republic. 30,000 Free Corps stormed the city, killing approximately 1,000 civilians in the campaign and executing about 700 more in the aftermath. Did that stop the commie hissy fit? Of course it didn't! And I mean, you have to understand, Lenin is just a Poland away from knocking on these guys' back door. It's no big secret that support for a German communist revolution was coming from the East. So no, it didn't stop, it only escalated. And we'll talk more about that escalation in a minute, but first the Ruhr Uprising in the Ruhr region of Germany in the spring of 1920. About 50,000 people showed up to form the Ruhr Red Army. The Free Corps, which was supposed to have been dismantled under the Treaty of Versailles at this point, along with the German army, were sent in what has been described as a maximum of cruelty on both sides, with over 1,000 of the Ruhr Red Army dead, and with only light losses on the side of the military and the Free Corps. So at this point, you might be asking yourself, Aiden, what's the damn point of this history lesson? And now, dear friends, let me make that point abundantly clear to you. The Weimar Republic was a socialist-leaning, democratic society that made massive improvements to that society and to equality in the short time that it existed. And as time went on, it continued to make more and more pro-social legislation. Additionally, despite the harsh financial burdens laid upon it by the Treaty of Versailles, during the 1920s, the Republic became not just economically stable, but actually quite successful, and the arts flourished. All while this was building, though, the communist protesting didn't stop. And as the economy collapsed with the Great Depression, the protesting only worsened. The KPD did not cease the screeching and crying even after having been decimated time and time again. The pressure, perhaps in part from the Soviets, was overwhelming. A communist nation in Germany must exist. So what was the result of all of this? As the left grew more and more militant, so did the right. The Ruhr Uprising was a direct result of a similar uprising of the Free Corps, who were mostly right-leaning Republicans. They took over the city of Berlin. The coup ended because millions of German workers who supported the socialist-leaning government took up a strike and refused to provide supplies to the city. But do you know who was front and center of this first right-wing reactionary event? Oh, the mustachioed man himself, Adolf Hitler. The left kept throwing this temper tantrum against a successful society. These Free Corps, under the Treaty of Versailles, were about to lose their livelihood. And who's there to back them up? It's all Adolf. And now, this is the reason I just spent 10 minutes talking to you about German history, because I want to get into this Hitler thing. So yeah, my last 2 videos were about the left calling everyone they don't like Hitler. Yeah, that's something called Godwin's Law. It used to mean that if you compared someone to Hitler or Nazis, you automatically lost the argument. Now apparently it means you automatically win. And with the explosive growth of Antifa, and these violent leftist riots in the streets across the country, I think it's very, very important that I bring up history, because it has an absolutely terrible tendency to repeat itself. I'm not talking about Trump. I'm talking about the future. If you keep being so irate at this extremely progressive Western society that we live in, and demanding revolution, and demanding more and more extreme forms of socialism, do you understand what happens? When you're just screaming, just crying, just complaining, you radicalize everyone against you, and you make way for a manipulative, charismatic, and extremely persuasive egomaniac like Adolf Hitler to seize power. Oh, and if you accuse Trump of being those things, listen to the man talk sometimes, please. And so before I leave you folks, let's talk about Hitler's rise to power, because I really do not want this to be premonitory. The German Workers' Party, the DAP, was founded in 1919. Many of the members were Free Corps or former military who had strong beliefs in nationalism and who felt deeply offended by the Treaty of Versailles, particularly the War Guilt Clause, which they believed insulted the German people. As I said, the Free Corps was being disbanded under the treaty, and the Army and Navy were being massively diminished in size. In addition, these are people who had and would continue to be called in to stop commie hissy fits. They were ideologically against communism, and as I said, primarily nationalists. And you know what? Hitler was one of them. Young Adolf didn't want to leave the military because he didn't have any other skills. And he was among the few drawn to the DAP by their nationalistic and their anti-Semitic messages. Anti-Semitism, there it is. So why was the DAP anti-Semitic? So remember back when I said the German people were really fed up with the war? Well, these nationalists, they blamed that disillusion that people had with the war, not on the German people as a whole, but as the fault of the Jews. And essentially scapegoated, funny if you know the origin of that term, I suppose, the Jews for Germany's loss. So yeah, the Jews were a target for their angst. But society at large in Germany at the time was enamored with socialism, not nationalism, and as such the DAP was a paltry movement with under 100 members. So Hitler, who quickly gains leadership in this group through his charisma and persuasion, leads the effort in the rebranding, from the German Workers' Party to the National Socialist German Worker Party. You see the socialist part there? Yeah, that's just called playing to whatever the people want to hear. The people at large wanted to believe in socialism, but they were up against the wall of these extreme communists who could not stop invading their cities every other week, protesting in the streets, and generally spending the last 2 years collectively throwing a little crying competition, except it's a bit more violent than the ones we're currently seeing, at least at this point. And really, the rest from there is history. Hitler and the Nazis took over Germany. The Weimar Republic was shut down, and Germany started a new world war under the banners of German nationalism, fighting back about the insulting Treaty of Versailles, embracing German and Western values, Christianity, and white nationalism. So, if you haven't figured out what I'm trying to explicate here, let me make it a bit more salient. Germany had a socialist revolution that led to fast improvements in society, but the communists would not stop crying for more and more change, crying anti-German slogans, crying to adopt Russia as their big brother in the communist revolution, and the German people, downtrodden, insulted, and impoverished, grew sick and tired of it. They grew desperate for pro-German narratives. They grew desperate for someone to tell them their country was great rather than a piece of trash. They grew desperate for someone to blame the loss of World War I and the Treaty of Versailles. But they were also leftists, or socialists who wanted to support socialism. And who appeared and handed them all of that on a brown-shirted platter? Adolf Hitler. So Antifa, you fascist idiots. So Democrats, screaming and rioting in the streets, having to be shot down with rubber bullets. Yeah, it's you. Listen, if you keep this up, this rioting and protesting over nothing. Oh, and I know that it's over nothing because I know you cannot describe why you're doing it. You don't know what you're mad about.
Has Donald Trump said anything about being anti-LGBTQ?
He's anti-trans and anti-women. And he's...
How do you say that, though? Has he said anything specific?
He might not have.
Just understand that history has a horrible habit of repeating itself. And at least one time that communists and socialists did this, they ostracized normal society to the point where normal society decided to start committing genocide. Again, Trump's not Hitler. Please watch the videos I've already made on him and stay tuned for the ones in the pipeline. Trump is a pretty moderate populist guy. And if you think anything apart from that, sorry, but you've bought some serious lies, hook, line, and sinker. Stop listening to the Young Turks. This is just a word of warning. Be careful here. Because you are already seriously dividing the country, and dividing yourselves on top of that. If you hate Hitler so much, if you think everyone you don't like is a Nazi, you might want to reconsider some of your behavior. Because I really don't want an Adolf 2.0, and I don't think you do either, at least some of you. I've already illustrated how the extreme left is engaging in fascist violent behavior and are the ones engaging in an identity politics race war. So you've got socialist fascism combined with racism. Sound familiar? So the way I see things currently headed is that if the left keeps escalating this behavior, keeps creating constant propaganda, keeps engaging in identity politics, they will radicalize someone like Hitler. They're inviting it. It may be someone who co-opts the right or someone who co-opts the left. I'm not really sure on that at this point. But either way, both paths are not pretty. Again, I hate ending on a sour note, as if there were too many positive notes on this one. So here's a tasty little meme for you. If you liked this video, be sure to like and subscribe. I'm Aiden Paladin, Altana Volt.